Our Black Cultural Explosion. Want a little round of applause for that. Urban Forum 2023, our Black Cultural Explosion. Want to thank everyone for being here this morning, and I would like to introduce our Chief of Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Initiatives, Dr. Fatima Morel, for her welcome. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to Urban Forum 2023, a Black Cultural Explosion. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the McKinley High School Color Guard and the Pledge of Allegiance, led by Alejandro Rios from Lafayette International High School. And then please remain standing for the Black National Anthem performed by India Thompson and Karen Saxon, accompanist from City Honor School. Alejandro. Please post the color.
Ready, post. Breathe, man. Arm.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Juro lealtad a la bandera de los Estados Unidos de América y a la república que representa una nación bajo el poder de Dios, indivisible, con libertad y justicia para todos.
Thank you and muchas gracias. Thank you. Let's give another round of applause to the McKinley High School color guard and, of course, Miss India. India Thompson, and our Alejandro Rios. Let's give all of them a nice round of applause. Please be seated.
Thank you. I want to welcome you to the 8th Annual Urban Forum.
I would have to say, we moved into the month of February this year because we wanted to
Set a purpose of
Black excellence in our district that we know exists but is rarely spoken of. We know that there are limitations in our curriculum, in our schools and classrooms, in our community about the narrations of Black peoples and the contributions to the world of the African diaspora.
So, in setting Urban Forum in Black History Month, we want to today bring to you what we consider to be an explosion of culture, intellectual property, and greatness, a legacy of greatness, because we all are descendants. Believe it or not, from Africa. That is the cradle of civilization. And all human genetics point back to the first bones found in Kenya. So we know we're all connected. There is a one Eve in a one Adam. If they go back to Africa, and that connects each and every one of us in this room, whether we know it or not. And that is the greatness of all of us, because we are all connected to this human fabric of life. And I want to thank you for all the hard work you have been doing all year long to deliver the emancipation curriculum and to provide other culturally and linguistically supportive programs and structures for students and families in your schools and in our community. I would like to take this moment to recognize our Board of Education member, Ms. Jennifer McCosey. Mrs. McCosey, please stand. Yes. Thank you. And our guest speaker has just arrived. None other than CNN analyst and lawyer, activist, civil rights activist, New York State bestselling author, Bakari Sellers is in the house. And I will take the moment to thank our Board of Education members and our Superintendent Williams, who is so supportive of the work for equity in our district that allows such an event to take place. Without further ado, I would like to read the bio, the short bio of Attorney Sellers, and we will get right into the keynote. Two-time New York Times best-selling author, civil rights activist, attorney, entrepreneur, legislator, and overall prolific voice of the culture, Bakari Sellers continues to build upon the strong legacy he inherited as the son of Gwendolyn Sellers and civil rights leader Cleveland Sellers, while his dad helped shape movements working alongside Stokely Carmichael, Bayard Rustin, and Malcolm X. Bakari has come into his own, helping to write the blueprint for today's movements with the likes of Rep. James Clyburn, Attorney Benjamin Crump, and President Barack Obama. Bakari forged his own path from very early on. He entered Morehouse College at the age of 16. He went on to become a graduate of the University of South Carolina Law School, and he became the youngest legislator in the South Carolina State Legislature at the gentle age of 22. He carries this mantle of success with the right beginnings. He carries this mantle of success with the right balance of gravitas, style, generosity, and humility, a nod to his humble beginnings in Denmark, South Carolina, where please and thank you are the chief currency in town. And penning both his memoir, My Vanishing Country, and a children's book entitled, Who Are Your People? Bakari pays homage to the working class elders that encouraged him to dream with his eyes wide open, and that are predicate for his persistent fight for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the U.S. and abroad. A CNN analyst, Bakari also brings an ability to elevate discourse such that people always feel one step closer to a solution or resolution after he speaks. He combines these and many other talents in his new podcast, the Bakari Sellers podcast, which airs 2 times a week on the Ringer Podcast Network. Sellers has also been an attorney with the Strong Law Firm, LLC in Columbia, South Carolina since 2007, where he heads up the firm's strategic communication and public affairs team and the DEI consulting practice. He is married to Dr. Ellen Bakari Sellers, and they are the proud parents of 3 children. Whew, what a resume. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome to the Buffalo Public Schools, Mr. Bakari Sellers.
Enough. And so before I begin, I just want to say thank you to, and I think we owe her a round of applause, Dr. Morell, for bringing us all here together. And in the words of the great American poet, Sean Carter, also known as Jay-Z, you guys could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with us today. So give yourselves a round of applause as well. I appreciate coming to events such as these because they show intentionality and they show purpose. Many times during the celebration of a month like this, in between January 15th and the end of Black History Month, we do things just because. But the reason that I circled this on my calendar is because this event in particular was intentional and purposeful in its meaning and the reason that we've gathered here today. And so this morning we're going to do 2 things. I'm going to speak for a little while, try not to bore you to death, and then we're going to, Daphne has allowed me to say that we're going to ask questions. And so we're going to ask any questions, and I know that people oftentimes like to play pundit at night on their TV screens and throw things at it, and now is your opportunity to do that as well. And I'm also going to treat you all in my remarks a lot like Elizabeth Taylor treated all 7 of her husbands, which means I'm not going to keep you long. But I do believe that it's necessary on this day of intentionality, this day of purpose, that we have conversation about a journey. And with every single journey, there has to be a destination. And the reason that I love speaking in these institutions of learning is because I think in particular with your jobs that are somewhat thankless, people do not say those two very important words to you often enough, simply thank you for what you're doing and pouring into our next generation. It's necessary that we refocus what our goal is on this journey together. And I would say that this morning, we're going to take a journey to excellence. A journey to excellence. And excellence is what every day's goal should be, but even more important, it's what is required of us at this particular moment when it feels like the world is crumbling around us. And so let me apologize to Dr. Morrell beforehand for bombarding you with questions that are rooted in such simplicity, but there are two questions that we have to answer as we navigate this journey to excellence. And you don't have to write these down, they aren't that profound, but they're necessary to answer as we navigate this journey. The first is quite simply, how far have we come? And the next is, where do we go from here? I'm a firm believer that in whatever you do, whether or not you're a teacher, a principal, a student, a basketball player, whether or not you're a content creator, whether or not you are an engineer, you always have to ask yourself these two very simple questions. Whether or not you are a husband, a wife, a brother, a sister, or a girlfriend, a boyfriend, you have to ask yourself in those moments of introspection, how far have we come and where do we go from here? And so for me, in order to answer the first question of how far have we come, I like to use some historical context. I think back to the mid-1940s, and there was a young man named George Elmore. George Elmore was considered to be a Renaissance Negro. He was unique because he was so fair-skinned that he could pass for being white. But they said that George was a Renaissance Negro because in the 40s, George owned a five and dime store, a liquor store, drove a cab, and took pictures on the side. But George got this crazy idea that he was going to register to vote. And so George went down to the county voter registration office, and they actually gave George his voter registration card. And in August of 46, George went down and tried to cast his ballot in the Democratic primary, but who are the nosiest people in the world? Poll workers. Poll workers are by far the nosiest people in all the world. They're in everybody's business. And them poll workers said, George, we know who you are. You're a Negro. You can't vote here. But see, George was filled with audacity. George was filled with faith. And so George filed this lawsuit. It was called Elmore versus Rice. But as soon as he filed the lawsuit, they stopped distributing to his five and dime store. They firebombed his liquor store. His wife literally died in a mental health facility from having to undergo the trauma of the terror and the crosses being burned on her yard. You see, George Elmore lost absolutely everything. He died a very broken man emotionally, physically, mentally. But Elmore versus Rice is the reason that many African Americans, particularly in the South, can vote in our country's primary system. So ask yourself that very simple question, since George Elmore in the mid-1940s, how far have we come? I think about Sarah Mae Fleming all the time. How many of you all know who Sarah Mae is? Okay. Sarah Mae is one of my heroes. I think she's one of the baddest women of the movement. You see, Sarah Mae Fleming was what they called a 22-year-old domestic worker, which means she cleaned up the hotels. She cleaned up the downtown area. And Sarah, one day, she got off work with her girlfriend from doing that back-breaking labor, and she was tired. She got on the bus, and Sarah Sin wasn't sitting at the front of the bus. It was that when the bus driver told her to get up, she went out the front door, which was for the whites, instead of the back doors, which was for the coloreds. And the bus driver grabbed her by the back of the neck and punched her in the stomach and rolled her down the steps. Sarah was so dope because, see, Sarah was not looking to make history that day. John Lewis used to tell me all the time, he would say, little CL, always be prepared to walk onto the pages of history. You see, she wasn't looking to make history that day. Instead, history found her. And I guess it reminds me of Isaiah in the Bible. And if anybody's ever seen me drink, they know I'm the furthest thing from a pastor. But I will quote this scripture because it reminds me of in the book of Isaiah when Isaiah was in the full awe and glory of the Lord, and the question was asked, who shall go for me? And he said, here am I, Lord, send me. You see, Sarah wasn't looking to make history that day, but she said, here am I, send me. So she joined with some young enterprising lawyers from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and they filed a lawsuit. It was called Fleming versus SCE&G, and Sarah Mae Fleming laid the foundation in action and law for another young lady who sat down 18 months later named Rosa Parks. So again, since Sarah Mae Fleming took that seat first, ask yourself that very simple question, how far have we come? And then my favorite story of all are the parents, Harry and Eliza Briggs. I absolutely love Harry and Eliza Briggs. They were parents not far from where I'm from in very small Clarendon County, South Carolina. It's actually known for its barbecue. But in 1949, parents of black children, they didn't want their kids per se to have everything that the white kids had, but they did want their kids to be able to ride school buses. You know how your grandparents tell you the stories of having to walk to school uphill both ways? 75% of that is probably true. And so in South Carolina, particularly throughout the Deep South, kids would have to wake up at 3 or 4 a.m. just to walk to school while white kids got to ride school buses. And so Harry and Eliza Briggs were parents, and they got this crazy idea they were going to sue the school superintendent. And they did. It was known as Briggs v. Elliott, and Briggs v. Elliott was the first case filed in the landmark collection of cases known as Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. It was actually started right in South Carolina. And Chief Justice Warren in Brown versus the Board of Education got a very rare unanimous opinion. He held that segregation causes a sense of inferiority by placing children in environments not conducive to learning. Listen to that holding of Brown. He said segregation causes a sense of inferiority by placing children in environments not conducive to learning. That, by the way, that is not impressive, being able to memorize the holding of Brown. That is what $100,000 worth of law school debt will get you. But since that ruling in Brown, ask yourself that very, very simple question, how far have we come? Think about George Elmore. George Elmore literally gave up everything he had. He gave all of his being so that he could cast that ballot or have that right to the franchise, so he could access the ballot box. But today we live in communities where people make it harder to vote, and we have an entire generation that does not understand the import of casting the ballot. So ask yourself that question, how far have we come? Think about Sarah Mae Fleming. She just wanted access to public transportation. But today we live in communities where many black folk and brown folk and poor folk don't have access to public transportation or affordable housing or even clean water. What if I tell you there are 100 cities in these United States of America that have less potable water than Flint, Michigan? So again, ask yourself that very simple question, how far have we come? And think about Harry and Eliza Briggs. All they wanted was an opportunity for their children to have access to a school bus. But now we live in communities where kids are simply punished because of the zip code that they're born into. Where kids go to school and their heating and air don't work, where their infrastructure is falling apart, and where we are trying to prepare children for a 21st century global economy with 19th century resources. So again, ask yourself that very simple question, how far have we come? And so I come from this very clear proposition that there's nothing irredeemable about this country that we live in. We just have to reimagine what she looks like. And so the answer to the question, how far have we come, is that we've made a great deal of progress. Anybody who tells you otherwise is simply being intellectually dishonest, because we have made progress in this country. But there is a comma and a ... because we still have yet a ways to go. And so on this journey to excellence, we've asked ourselves the first question, which is, how far have we come? And we've utilized the historical context to analyze that question. And the next question we have to ask ourselves is, where do we go from here? Now, this question is very, very difficult. And I'll tell you before we get started down this path that I don't have the answer. But Dr. King, uniquely enough, in his second best piece of writing, his best piece of writing was what? The letter from the Birmingham jail. If anybody was saying the I Have a Dream speech, we just fight after this. But the letter from the Birmingham jail was his best piece of writing, and his second best piece of writing was a really thin book. It was entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? And in that book, he gave us two choices. Dr. King was a great teacher, a great orator, because Dr. King knew that you could not give people and audiences a lot of choices. It was either justice or injustice. It was either liberty or bondage. It was either freedom or slavery. And this one, it was either chaos or community. The answer to the question, where do we go from here, was either chaos or community. Now, many times when you all see me on TV, or if it's funny, my mama watches MSNBC, which drives me crazy, but I usually have a little cryon under my stomach, and it will just simply say chaos at 1600 Pennsylvania, or chaos with a balloon flying over the country, or chaos here, or chaos in Palestine, Ohio, or chaos wherever it may be. And whenever we read the newspapers, or we're listening to the radio on our way in or away from work, we can't help but to believe that we are on the brink of chaos. But see, the challenge for all of us, particularly in this building of hope, is that we have to rebuild community. Let me tell you a story. It's about a young man who was born at 633 Frederick Street in little bitty Denmark, South Carolina. And when he was 10 years old in 1955, something happened that fundamentally changed his world. He would always refer to Mamie Till as being the strongest woman that he knew. Because in 1955, in a venue much like the one that we're in today, Mamie had an open casket for her son, Emmett. Are y'all allowed to bring phones in here? Y'all are grown. Y'all got y'all phones, right? Okay. Well, take your phones out. I tell people I don't mind when their phones go off when I speak, because I have stock in Verizon, so it don't bother me not one bit. But go to Al Gore's internet, for those of you all who have never seen it, and just pull up Emmett Till casket picture. And a trigger warning for those of you all who may have some issues with that, but it was a picture of a 13-year-old boy who had allegedly whistled at a white woman in Mississippi, and he was brutally lynched and thrown in a river, and the individuals who lynched him were found not guilty in a matter of minutes. And this young lady who said that Emmett had whistled at her as she is now trying to get into heaven, has now stated that she lied about that. But Mamie in 1955 had an open casket, and Emmett, if you look at his face, if you pull it up on your phones, you'll see that he literally is like his face was a pancake. He had no bones left intact. And she had that casket open because she wanted the world to see what hate and racism and bigotry had done to her child. And before you could go virtual on Snapchat, or viral, on Snapchat or TikTok, you went viral in Ebony magazine. And that picture of Emmett was actually in Ebony magazine. And this young man from Denmark, he ripped that picture out, he folded it up, and he put it in his wallet, and it spurred his activism. He's a part of what they call the Emmett Till generation. And he joined his local youth chapter of the NAACP. And his parents were middle class in the 50s. They owned a motel, they owned a juke joint where they served like 25-cent fish sandwiches. And they had a cab and they had some rental property. And they felt some type of way about not only their economic security, because they all knew the stories of people like George Elmore, but they felt some type of way about this young man's security as well, leading these protests in the city, because they didn't want him to end up like Emmett. And so this is where the story has a bit of irony in it. This young man from Denmark, his parents wanted to get him out of the movement, so they sent him to Howard University, which makes no sense to nobody. And then to compound it a little bit, when he got to Howard University, he was roommates with Stokely Carmichael. And Stokely actually graduated from Howard and then convinced this young man from Denmark to drop out of school and join the civil rights movement. And so he did. He dropped out of school and he joined this small fledgling civil rights organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. They got paid $8 a week. And one of their first missions, they had to go to Miami University of Ohio. I like talking about Miami University of Ohio just briefly, because people do not know the role that it played in our civil rights history. See, Miami University of Ohio is where civil rights workers went to train before they went down to register voters in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. And so this young man from Denmark was at Miami University of Ohio when he got a phone call that 3 of his friends had gone missing. Their names were Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. And he led the search mission down to Philadelphia, Mississippi. How many of y'all have ever been to Philadelphia, Mississippi? Raise your hand. Correct. It's the size of this auditorium. But during the day, they would have to hide in barns and sheds, and at night they would go out and look in ditches and trenches, and they couldn't wear any belt buckles or any boots or anything shiny because they were afraid of being caught. And ironically enough, they found their bodies subsequently behind the home of one of the local sheriff's deputies and minister. He was a sheriff deputy and he was a minister in the town who did some lynching on the side. But that was this young man from Denmark's first indoctrination into the movement. He ended up becoming national field director and program secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He served under both John Lewis and Stokely Carmichael. And then he came back home to our great state of South Carolina and became involved in the most deadly civil rights demonstration this country's ever seen. The most deadly civil rights demonstration this country has ever seen. You see, on the night of February 6th, 1968, the students at South Carolina State College, as it was known at the time, decided they were going to protest the All-Star Bowling Alley. It's what the history books call the last vestige of discrimination. It was Jim Crow's final hiding place in Little Orangeburg, South Carolina. It sits in a right angle, which is necessary for this demonstration. And what was supposed to happen was 3 students were supposed to go into this bowling alley and take a knee and sit down and be arrested, and they were going to fight this injustice in the court of law. But when they got there, city police and state troopers were already inside of the bowling alley, and the students began to funnel into the right angle, and city police began to surround the students on the outside. I didn't do well in math, so somebody's going to have to tell you what that angle is. And as the students got louder, the police began to press up against the students, and the students ended up pressing up against the glass, and then the glass broke. And when the glass broke, all hell broke loose, and the police began to beat many of the students. But they beat them not with normal police batons. Back then, they had these batons that were about this long, but at the end of them, they had these leather rawhide whips. And so James Stroman, who was a young co-ed at the time, talks about a young woman being held by 2 state troopers while another one beat her. And the students that night at South Carolina State, they had to go back to their campus and heal not only their physical wounds, but their emotional wounds and mental wounds as well. And then came February 7th, 1968. Older people have a saying, I think it's like, the tension is so thick you can cut it with a knife. Who's East's rival? Y'all got a rival over here? West? Is it West? I mean, I'm just out here guessing. Y'all ain't got no rival? Okay, so y'all don't have no rival. It's kind of like when Morehouse plays Clark Atlanta, and after the game, you in the parking lot and you feel like something about to pop off. That's what it felt like on the 7th. It was that level of tension, but nothing happened. And then came that fateful day of February 8th, 1968, when the students went back down to the bowling alley, but this time, when the state troopers came, they got the right idea. They went back to their campus. They went back to their campus. They went back to their campus. And they built this huge bonfire. And I don't know how many of you all have been down south around this time, but it's not cold, it's just cool. And the fire would warm your bones ever so gently, and the embers would illuminate the darkness. And the students, they felt safe and comfort in their numbers because they had gathered together much as for the same reason that we've gathered here today, for a singular cause and a common good. But they also could not foresee what would happen next. You see, the students did not foresee that South Carolina State Troopers would line up along the embankment in front of their campus like they did. They did not foresee that they would have shotguns loaded with deadly double-aught buckshot, so the same bullets we use to hunt deer. And they did not foresee that those shotguns would be turned on them with deadly intent. And for 8 seconds, 1001, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 shots were fired into the group of students. It killed 3, Henry Smith, Samuel Hammond, and Delano Middleton, and wounded another 28. This young man from Denmark was actually shot in the shoulder that night. And he went to the infirmary, but when he got to the infirmary, they told him there was nothing they could do for him there. He had to go to the hospital. And when he got to the hospital, he was pointed out by the only black sheriff deputy in Orangeburg County at the time. And they knew he was a member of SNCC, and they deemed him to be an outside agitator, and they arrested him. They arrested him and charged him with 5 felony counts, looking at a maximum of 75 years in prison. In fact, in between the night of February 8th, 1968, and this young man from Denmark's trial, all 9 officers who fired shots into the group of students were tried. All of them were found not guilty. This young man from Denmark went to trial, and the lead investigator from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division said that due to the time that had passed, he had misplaced all the evidence, but he himself was a witness, and he remembers not on the night of the 8th, but on the night of the 6th, this young man from Denmark standing on top of a fire truck, lighting a Bic and saying, "Burn, baby, burn." And so his indictment was backdated from February 8th to February 6th. Most of his charges were dismissed, save for one, which was rioting. And he was charged, tried, and convicted of rioting, effectively becoming the only one-man riot in the history of this country. And he was sentenced to a year of hard labor. On that night, injustice had left mothers without their sons. It left the pages of my state's history stained red with blood. But if you look at that young man from Denmark today and you see that his shoulders aren't as upright as they once were from carrying the burdens of a generation, or his eyes don't pop like they used to from shedding the tears because of so many loved ones lost throughout the pendency of the movement, and you ask him what's the greatest sacrifice he had to make, he'll tell you the greatest sacrifice he had to make was not being in jail or losing his freedom per se. The greatest sacrifice he had to make was not being housed on death row while his bond was denied, but the greatest sacrifice he had to make was being in jail for the birth of his oldest daughter, or my big sister, because this young man from Denmark who grew into a civil rights hero is my father, Cleveland Sellers. And the lessons that I learned from people like Jimmy Lee Jackson and Septima Clark and Jessica Simpkins, the lessons that I learned from people like Emmett Till and Medgar Evers and Smith, Hammond, and Middleton, and all of those names, even before you get to the Martin, Malcolm, and Rosa, is that the answer to the question, where do we go from here, lies fundamentally in the ability for us to do 2 things. The first is, and I love this phrase, And I think that whether or not you are 4 or 44 or 64, you have to rededicate yourself to this proposition of dreaming with your eyes open. The second thing is, and this is really difficult, particularly for black folk, this is why I say I'm not there yet. Are y'all familiar with the saying, he ain't done with me yet? Because one of the things that we have to do along this journey, and listen to me on this point intently, please, because this is exhausting, but we also have to rededicate ourselves to loving our neighbors. But there's a ... Because many of us have to love our neighbors even when they don't love us. And do you understand how hard that fundamentally is, and how tiring and exhausting it is to make sure that you have that unconditional love for a neighbor when you know that love is not reciprocated because of your skin color or who you pray to or who you love? And so we have to be very cognizant that on this journey to excellence, as we ask ourselves these questions, in particular, where do we go from here, it's incumbent upon us for us to continue to love even when they don't love us. And I'll share with you this one story before I take questions to help embody what I mean by dream with your eyes open. When I was 20 years old, I had just graduated from college. I went to Morehouse when I was 16. And when I was 20, I had just graduated. And I never forget, I felt like I had a lot of swag back then. I came downstairs, and my mom was cooking spaghetti, and my dad was doing something that old people do, which drives me crazy. He was reading the newspaper at the end of the day. I don't know why old people read the newspaper like after work. That news is officially like 36 hours old. Like there is of no value to reading the newspaper at 6 p.m. But I digress. So anyway, he was reading the newspaper, and I stood in between the cook island and our wet bar, our little wet bar. And I leaned up and I said, "Mom, Dad, I'm going to run for the South Carolina State House of Representatives." At that time, I was 20. I was running against Thomas Rhode, who was 82, who had been in office for 26 years, which was longer than I had been born. And before he was in the State House, he was chair of county council. Before he was chair of county council, he delivered the mail. And before he delivered the mail, he delivered the milk. He was literally the milkman, so he knew everybody in the county. And it was funny, this conversation, because it's indicative of my upbringing. Without missing a beat, my mom said, "I'd vote for you." And my dad said, "I'll think about it." And so I knew I had a long way to go. I went out and we knocked on over 2,600 doors. Because y'all are really city folk, I have to explain to you what that is. I had to explain this to Cory Booker one day, because apparently you all live in cities up here where people have buildings where you live on top of each other. Where I'm from, you knock on a door, you drive a mile, and then you knock on another door. And I went over 55 churches. And on June 13th of 2006, we won that race, and I became the youngest black elected official in the country. But something was happening. That was it's a long time ago. If people still clapping for accomplishments 20 years ago, you got to do something else. So something was happening in our country at the time. I don't know if you all remember, in 2006, everybody and their mama was running for president of the United States. And so we had Dennis Kucinich. You remember Dennis Kucinich? Some of y'all are like, no, that's okay. Nobody remembered it when he was running. We had Bill Richardson. We had Chris Dodd. We had Hillary Clinton. We had Barack Obama. We had Joe Biden running for like the 4th time at that time. And so it was a lot of people running for president of the United States. And I felt like a 5-star athlete, because I was the youngest state legislator and the youngest black elected official in the country. And I was in South Carolina, which is the first primary in the South. And so they're all calling me, asking me to endorse them to be president of the United States of America. And so I'm also the only legislator with a book bag, because I'm in law school. I literally am in school while I'm in the State House. And so the State House and the law school are about half a mile away. And I'll never forget, one day I was walking from law school, and I was always notoriously late for class. And I was walking to constitutional law. Put a pin in that real quick because that's actually important to this story. And so I'm walking with my book bag on, and my phone rings, and it's a private number. And students in here, and I do want my students, this is not a part of my remarks, but just know that if somebody calls you from a private number, it's either one of two people. It's either somebody very important, or it's a student loan company calling you to get their money back. And so I pick up the phone, and they say, do you have time to speak to Senator Obama? And I say, of course I do. I had met with the senator many times before, and I had narrowed my choices down to John Edwards or Barack Obama. And let's just say, thank God I made the right choice. And so I pick up the phone, and they say, Senator Obama's on the line. And so I start to speak to him. Had a brain freeze because the senator says, and what are you doing now? And I say, I'm on my way to constitutional law class. And why is that a brain freeze? Because Barack Obama used to do what? Teach constitutional law. So he begins to ask me all of these questions about where we were in class, in cases, and I was like any good law student, which means I hadn't read all semester. And so I was like, Senator, let's kind of get through this. What do you want on this fine day, sir? And the senator says, well, you know, now is the time I want you to endorse me to be president of the United States. I say, Senator, I'll do so under two conditions. One is that you come to my district, very poor, rural South Carolina. The other is that my mama gets to work on a campaign. My daddy wants to get her out the house for a little while. And he says, done and done. And so I travel all around the country. I travel with Cal Penn from Harold and Kumar. I travel with Tatiana Ali. There's a generation in this room who has no idea who Tatiana Ali is, and that is very, very sad. And I travel sometimes with the former First Lady of the United States, Michelle Obama. And so finally I get a phone call in January of 2008. This was after the senator had won Iowa and lost New Hampshire, that he wanted to come to my district. And I began to panic slightly because, see, I have stock in Verizon. That makes me excited. I began to panic because I'm from the poor rural South. We didn't have no place to put Barack Obama. And so we decided to put him slightly outside of my district on the campus of South Carolina State University in the gymnasium that is now named after those three young men who were killed in the Orangeburg Massacre. It's the Smith, Hammond, and Middleton Auditorium. And so that day we pull up, and I have State House security with me. And I'll never forget, this was at the height of Obama mania in 2008. People are coming from Maryland and Virginia and North Carolina, miles around, just to tug on the proverbial hem of his garment. And I walk in and I go to the green room, which was the men's basketball locker room. It smelled like Gatorade and socks, right? And sitting down is Kerry Washington and Chris Tucker. And so me, Kerry, and Chris, we're just laughing and talking and having fun. And in politics, everything is late. And so after about 45 minutes, my good friend Rick Wade peeks his head in and says, I'm going to the airport. And he goes to the airport and he comes back with Usher. So it's me, Usher, Chris Tucker. It's a true story. I got pictures. It's me, Usher, Chris Tucker, and Kerry Washington, and we're waiting on Barack Obama. And finally, the senator gets there and they say it's go time. And very rarely do I get a great introduction like I got today. Usually when you speak around the world or around the country, they have this thing that's called a VOG, a V-O-G. We affectionately refer to it as the voice of God. And it's like, and now, welcome to the stage, Representative Bakari Sellers. And so you got to remember, I'm literally 19 miles away from my home. And so this is a combination of the entire world coming to see Barack Obama and like everybody I grew up with. And so when I come out, the crowd goes crazy, mainly because they think I'm Barack Obama. But regardless, I begin to walk down these guardrails where there's Secret Service and people are pulling on you and You're like autographing babies. It's pandemonium. And finally, I get to the stage, and the stage is very, very, very small. It's a fourth of this. And we're supposed to speak for about 5 minutes before we turn around and introduce our next guest. And I very rarely talk about Dr. King, but at this time I talked about Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, but not the rhythmic cadence of I Have a Dream that one day we shall. Instead, I talked about the most important part of that speech, in which he talks about the fierce urgency of now. And then I turn around and I introduce Chris Tucker, and the decibel level goes up a little bit. And then Chris comes out and speaks, and then he turns around and introduces Kerry Washington, and the decibel level goes up just that much more. And then Kerry comes out and introduces Usher, and then all the women start passing out. And then Usher speaks for way too long. And I have a funny Usher story if anybody wants to ask during a brief Q&A. And then Usher introduces Barack Obama, and I'll never forget, I don't know if you guys have been to a concert post-pandemic, but it was so loud. You know how you have that buzzing in your ear? It's like a rock star had been in the building. And we're supposed to stand on stage behind Barack Obama while he speaks, but he looks at us and says, y'all got to get off the stage. But we take this picture, and to my left is Chris Tucker, and to my right was this cool dude from Hawaii who ended up being the 44th president of the United States. To his right was Kerry Washington, and to her right was Usher Raymond IV. And people always ask me, they say, what were you thinking at that moment? And you know how you have moments of clarity? Like, I'll never forget what I was thinking at that moment. I was thinking I was 19 miles away from where I had the audacity to dream that I wanted to be a part of the change I wanted to see in the world, where I had this dream I could run for office and change my community, where I did not have to be defined by the zip code that I was in. And I was 300 yards away from where my father was literally shot, so that I would have an opportunity to stand on a stage such as this, and the blood of my family literally ran through the soil of this great country. And although I was 19 miles away from my home and 300 yards away from where my father was shot, I had gone so far. I don't know if you all know the story of Barack Obama. We ended up winning South Carolina, and he ended up becoming the first black president in the history of this country. But to be able to play a ripple in that change of current in this country's history was fascinating for a young guy from the big city of Denmark, South Carolina. But I share that with you so you understand the concept of dreaming with your eyes open. And as we're on this journey to excellence, you have to ask yourself that first question again, which is, how far have we come? And you have to use whatever historical context. Now, you have to be honest about your history too. That's a whole nother lecture, and I don't want anybody to get in trouble. But you have to ask that question, and then you have to pivot and ask the next question, which is, where do we go from here? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that it requires you to dream, and I know it requires you to love even when they don't love you. And then and only then can you get to the destination, which is excellence. And I hate when people speak to me or speak in settings and they take me somewhere and then I don't know where I'm supposed to be. So let's define what excellence is just momentarily. You know, the greatest educator of all time, and I know I'm in a room full of educators. If you think you're that good, you can be number two. But the greatest educator of all time is a man named Benjamin Elijah Mays. He's from Greenwood, South Carolina. He was the 6th president of Morehouse College. Without Benjamin Mays, there'd be no Martin Luther King Jr. And Dr. Mays once said, in all things that you do them so well that no man living, dead, or yet to be born can do them better. You see, that is the definition of excellence. In this building of hope, that is our expectation of everyone from the janitors to the principal in it, to every single day be on that journey to excellence. And then when you get there, understand that your name may not be in lights and you may not be rich and famous, but maybe somebody somewhere, maybe George Elmore or Sarah Mae Fleming, maybe Harry and Eliza Briggs, maybe Henry Smith or Samuel Hammond or Delano Middleton, maybe Goodman, Schwerner, or Cheney will be able to look at you at the end of that journey and simply say, job well done. So with that, let's take some questions if anybody has any. We have 10 minutes, so I'm not getting yelled at by Ms. Morrell. We got 10 minutes to ask questions. I do this with older crowds, but questions have question marks. Sometimes people like to give their own speech after we get done, so just know that questions do have question marks. And I do believe there is a such thing as dumb questions. Don't know how we got started down this path of saying there's no such thing as a stupid question. There are such things as stupid questions. But there's no pressure. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Hi, I'm so happy to have you here. I've seen you on CNN and
cool.
all sorts of other networks. And my question has to do with that work. I've seen you debate with your colleagues. How do you tolerate some of that?
Oh, good question. Yeah, that's a good question. So, you have moments where you're like, is this the day I'm gonna get fired? You know, like, am I just gonna risk it all today is the question. So there are two things, well, three things. One, I always like to be as prepared as possible. And I like to be the most prepared person in the room if I can afford to be. Every morning I wake up, I have a very kind of insane, almost illogical kind of routine, but I read the Miami Herald, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Charlotte Observer, and I have somebody clip local articles in South Carolina for me. And then about 11:30 or 12, I'll read the LA Times, just so I can kind of understand the world around me. So I like to be prepared so I can talk to, for my daily task of being on TV. The pressure is that you can't have a bad day, because the way that many white folks see black people is through the lens of me when they watch TV. And I say that as humble as possible. So I can't go up there and be like, y'all know what, I just had a bad day. I'm sorry, I'm not prepared today. It doesn't work that way, and there aren't many of us on TV, and so you have to carry that pressure of wanting to do extremely well all the time. And then this is something that you need to remember. This is advice my daddy gave me, and I would encourage everyone under the sound of my voice to hear it. That you never argue with a fool, because people watching cannot tell the difference. Ooh. And so I never try to change the mind of the person that I'm talking to, because my job is not to convince them. My job is to educate a viewer or give a viewer something to think about, and always speak my truth. And so I never really get in the mud or, hey, what is it? You don't wrestle with pigs because both of you get muddy and only the pig likes it. And so like I don't do that, and I try to stay above the fray and not get fired. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
I bought my daughter your book for Christmas, and in the book it kind of alludes to what you're talking about with showing people love and interacting with people.
Which book? That was really pompous of me. I'm sorry. Which New York Times bestseller did you get her? I mean, the children's book? How old is the picture book? Okay.
My daughter is 8, so.
Okay, all right.
But yeah, so I was wondering, how do you suggest moving to that cultural shift of, people talking to each other, people, like, you're from the South, so you have like Southern hospitality, but this is New York, not New York City, but we still New York. So
no, I noticed.
Like people don't talk.
I waved at some people walking in, and they were like, "Why is he waving at me?"
Right.
And, so there are a couple of things. What's your name?
Veronica Golden.
Veronica. There are a couple of things. One, we have to do a better job of meeting people where they are. I'm a firm believer that you can't really start conversations in this country with, "Hey, Tracy, how do you feel about abortion?" Right? I think we need to do a better job of meeting people where they are and asking them things about how was your day or how is your family, or talk to me about your weekend, and begin to get out of the 140 character dialogue that we've been having for far too long, right? It's like the McDonaldization of America, that we want everything, including our conversations, to be how we want it and quick and ready. And that's just not the way that society should run. For these more difficult conversations, I think that, Veronica, you should also understand that ending racism is not on black folk in this country. It's like we have a lot of burdens, and that ain't really one of the burdens that I really carry. But I do think it's necessary that when allies or other people in this room who may not look like you want to have conversations, that we make those conversations, or we at least make the environment pleasant and comfortable, and not be so quick to judge and or cancel for a misstatement, a misquote, or simple ignorance because they don't know the cultural sensibilities. I think for far too long, it's very difficult for others to have conversations because they're walking on eggshells, simply not knowing what they don't know. I'm not saying let somebody touch your hair, but I am saying that they may not understand why you love Beyonce the way that you do, right? I mean, so I think that we have to be willing to have a warm and open spirit, one of openness, but we also, it's a two-way street. And I think that if people are willing to help us in this journey, we have to be willing to listen. And I think that also goes for our allies. There's certain like I may have a great message, but I also recognize that I'm not the perfect messenger for everywhere and everybody. Sometimes you need to go home and have those conversations with your own family. There are places that I'm not allowed to go where people won't have honest conversations with me that they will with somebody else in this auditorium. And we need to recognize that, and people need to be willing to have those conversations as well. That's a good question, Veronica.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And welcome. My apologies for being late. I'm Sharon Belton-Cotman. I am the president of the Buffalo Board of Education.
Well, congratulations.
Some people say that. The president of the teachers union called me up and said he has a psychologist for me in the event that I ever need it for taking the job
I'm a
again.
big believer in therapy, so go ahead and get your appointments today.
So with that said, thank you for coming to our city and blessing our community.
For sure.
Considering where we are in our time and space, particularly with urban education, the needs and the lack of evidence that manifests itself within our school systems, what advice or encouragement can you give this audience who, if you take it into consideration, have elected and chosen to become educators and mind guardians? What advice can you give to them for our children today? Thank you.
First of all, let me just say that I absolutely love and adore you. And I mean, I don't just mean the president, but I mean all of you all in this room, because, I taught a semester at the University of Chicago. I called them my Range Rover babies. And I learned a lot about myself, including the fact that I probably would never be a teacher again. And I remember Miss Carter in 3rd grade. I remember Miss Archery in 5th grade. I remember Miss Samuels in 1st grade, or Mr. Robinson in 4th. And I remember how they would get to school early or leave school late, and how I maybe had classmates that didn't have something, but they were always there for them. And I don't think that people tell the individuals in this room thank you enough for how much you all mean to this community. You are the fabric of this community. And so I am not here to have the audacity to tell you how to do your job, but I can tell you my belief very fundamentally, for example, is you teach a kid that he can be a black doctor if he's never seen one. And you can't teach a kid that they can be an Hispanic astronaut or lawyer if they've never seen one. And so the co-curricular experiences that you share with your students is of that much more import today, and bringing the community to your classroom. You know, we want our kids to grow up and be businessmen, but they don't see businessmen when they go home. They don't know what a C-suite executive looks like. And so that means that you need to call whatever corporation is here on this side of town and say, I need to speak to your CEO, and can they please come visit my 9th grade class, because my 9th grade boys and girls need to be able to see what that looks like. 2 stories quickly. One is, I'm from Denmark, very poor town, and my daddy ran the summer program, and at the end of it cost $100 a family, and we didn't, you know, he never got the $100 from every family, and it was only supposed to be for 50 kids, and I don't know if they had this, I'm pretty sure they did up here though. Y'all remember the summer lunch program? Yeah, okay. So we had the summer lunch program that would come feed us, and then we'd have teachers, 2 teachers from the elementary school would come and give us a lesson in the morning, and then we jump ditches and play football and basketball in the afternoon during the summers. And at the end of the summer, we would get 2 school buses from the school district, and we would go to Carowinds. Carowinds is like Six Flags, but it's a theme park. Carowinds is unique because it's like right along the North Carolina-South Carolina border, right outside of Charlotte. And when you go to Carowinds, you would be surprised what my friend's favorite attraction was. It was not the Daryl Earnhardt roller coaster. It was not the turkey legs. But it was when you walk into Carowinds, you are on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina, and you can straddle it and take a picture. And we would waste a full hour or 2 so everybody could get their picture on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina, so they could go home and show their friends and family that they had been somewhere. See, it's the power of showing people that they can go somewhere that oftentimes we forget in our daily task. And I ain't gonna blame this on the teachers union or the board president or whomever it may be that you may find yourself teaching the test. But what I am going to say is that we have to do a better job of creating full humans, like full good humans. And I guess the example thing that I feel like my